Chapters 66 through 68 of Foul Play by Charles Reade and Dion Boucicault. This recording is in the public domain. 66. Helen asked Arthur Wardlaw why he was so surprised at the prayer book being brought back. Was it worth £20 to anyone except herself? Arthur looked keenly at her to see whether she intended more than met the ear, and then said he was rather surprised at the rapid effect of his advertisement, that was all. "Now you have got the book," said he, "I do hope you will erase that cruel slander on one whom you mean to honour with your hand." This proposal made Helen blush and feel very miserable. Of the obnoxious lines, some were written by Robert Penfold, and she had so little of his dear handwriting. "I feel you are right, Arthur," said she, "but you must give me time. Then they shall meet no eye but mine, and on our wedding day, of course, all memorials of one—" Tears completed the sentence. Arthur Wardlaw, raging with jealousy at the absent Penfold, as heretofore Penfold had raged at him, heaved a deep sigh and hurried away, while Helen was locking up the prayer book in her desk. By this means he retained Helen's pity. He went home directly, mounted to his bedroom, unlocked a safe, and plunged his hand into it. His hand encountered a book. He drew it out with a shiver and gazed at it with terror and amazement. It was the prayer book he had picked up in the square and locked up in that safe. Yet that very prayer book had been restored to Helen before his eyes, and was now locked up in her desk. He sat down with the book in his hand, and a great dread came over him. Hitherto, candour and credulity only had been opposed to him, but now cunning had entered the field against him. A master hand was co-operating with Helen. Yet, strange to say, she seemed unconscious of that co-operation. Had Robert Penfold found his way home by some strange means? Was he watching over her in secret? He had the woman he loved watched day and night, but no Robert Penfold was detected. He puzzled his brain night and day, and at last he conceived a plan of deceit which is common enough in the East, where lying is one of the fine arts, but was new in this country, we believe, and we hope to heaven we shall not be the means of importing it. An old clerk of his father's, now superannuated and pensioned off, had a son upon the stage, in a very mean position. Once a year, however, and of course in the dog days, he had a kind of benefit at his suburban theatre. That is to say, the manager allowed him to sell tickets, and to take half the price of them. He persuaded Arthur to take some, and even go to the theatre for an hour. The man played a little part of a pompous sneak, with some approach to nature. He seemed at home. Arthur found this man out, visited him at his own place. He was very poor, and mingled pomposity with obsequiousness, so that Arthur felt convinced he was to be bought body and soul, what there was of him. He sounded him accordingly, and the result was that the man agreed to perform a part for him. Arthur wrote it, and they rehearsed it together. As to the dialogue, that was so constructed that it could be varied considerably according to the cues, which could be foreseen to a certain extent; but not precisely, since they were to be given by Helen Rolleston, who was not in the secret. But while this plot was fermenting, other events happened, with rather a contrary tendency; and these will be more intelligible if we go back to Nancy Rouse's cottage, where indeed we have kept Joseph Wiley in an uncomfortable position a very long time. Mrs. James from next door was at last admitted into Nancy's kitchen, and her first word was, "I suppose you know what I'm come about, ma'am?" "Which it is to return me the saucepan you borrowed, no doubt," was Nancy's ingenuous reply. "No, ma'am. But I'll send my girl in with it, as soon as she have cleaned it, you may depend." "Thank ye. I shall be glad to see it again." "You're not afeard I shall steal it, I hope?" "La, bless the woman! Don't fly out at a body like that. I can't afford to give away my saucepan. Saucepans is not in my head. Nor in your hand, neither. I've come about my lodger, a most respectable gentleman, which he have met with an accident. He did but go to put something away in the chimbly, which he is a curious gent, and has travelled a good deal, and learned the foreign customs, when his hand was caught in the brickwork somehows, and there he is hard and fast." "Do you know anything about this?" said Nancy to the mite severely. No, said the mite with a countenance of polished granite. La bless me, said Nancy with a sudden start. Why, is she talking about the thief as you and I catched putting his hand through the wall into my room, and made him fast again the policeman comes round? Thief? Cried Mrs. James. No more a thief than I am. Why, sure you wouldn't ever be so cruel. Oh dear, oh dear. Spite goes a far length. There, take and kill me, do, and then you'll be easy in your mind. Ah, little my poor father thought as ever I should come down to letting lodgings, and being maltreated this way. I am. Who is a maltreating of ye? Why, you're dreaming. Have a drop of gin. With them as takes the police to my lodger. It would choke me. Well, have a drop, and we'll see about it. You're very kind, ma'am, I'm sure. Heaven knows I need it. Here's wishing you a good husband, and toward burying all unkindness. Which you means drownding of it. Ah, you're never at a loss for a word, ma'am, and always in good spirits. But your troubles is to come. I'm a widdy. You will let me see what is the matter with my lodger, ma'am. Why not? We'll go and have a look at him. Accordingly, the three women and the mite proceeded to the little room. Nancy turned the gas on, and then they inspected the imprisoned hand. Mrs. James screamed with dismay, and Nancy asked her dryly whether she was to blame for seizing a hand which had committed a manifest trespass. You have got the rest of his body, said she, but this here hand belongs to me. Lord, ma'am, what could he take out of your chimbley without 'twas a handful of soot? Do pray let me loose him. Not till I have said 2 words to him. But how can you? He isn't here to speak to, only a morsel of him. I can go into your house and speak to him. Mrs. James demurred to that, but Nancy stood firm. Mrs. James yielded. Nancy whispered her myrmidons, and in a few minutes was standing by the prisoner, a reverend person in dark spectacles and a gray beard, that created commiseration, or would have done so, but that this stroke of ill fortune had apparently fallen upon a great philosopher. He had contrived to get a seat under him, and was smoking a pipe with admirable sang-froid. At sight of Nancy, however, he made a slight motion, as if he would not object to follow his imprisoned hand through the party wall. It was only for a moment. The next he smoked imperturbably. "Well, sir," said Nancy, "I hopes you are comfortable." "Thank you, miss, yes. I'm at a double sheet anchor." "Why do you call me miss?" "I don't know. Because you are so young and pretty." "That will do. I only wanted to hear the sound of your voice, Joe Wiley." And with the words she snatched his wig off with one hand and his beard with the other, and revealed his true features to his astonished landlady. "There, mum," said she, "I wish you joy of your lodger." She tapped the chimney 3 times with the poker, and telling Mr. Wiley she had a few words to say to him in private, retired for the present. Mrs. James sat down and mourned the wickedness of mankind, the loss of her lodger, who would now go bodily next door instead of sending his hand, and the better days she had by iteration brought herself to believe she had seen. Wiley soon entered Nancy's house, and her first question was, "The £2,000, how did you get them?" "No matter how I got them," said Wiley sulkily. "What have you done with them?" "Put them away." "That is all right. I'm blessed if I didn't think they were gone for ever." "I wish they had never come. Ill-gotten money is a curse." Then she taxed him with scuttling the Proserpine, and asked him whether that money had not been the bribe. But Joe was obdurate. "I never split on a friend," said he, "and you have nobody to blame but yourself. You wouldn't splice without £2,000. I loved you, and I got it how I could. D'ye think a poor fellow like me can make £2,000 in a voyage by hauling in ropes and tying true lovers' knots in the foretop?" Nancy had her answer ready, but this remembrance pricked her own conscience and paved the way to a reconciliation. Nancy had no high flown notions. She loved money, but it must be got without palpable dishonesty. Per contra, she was not going to denounce her sweetheart, but then again she would not marry him so long as he differed with her about the meaning of the eighth commandment. This led to many arguments, some of them warm, some affectionate. And so we leave Mr. Wiley under the slow but salutary influence of love and unpretending probity. He continued to lodge next door. Nancy would only receive him as a visitor. 67. Helen had complained to Arthur of all people, that she was watched and followed. She even asked him whether that was not the act of some enemy. Arthur smiled and said, "Take my word for it, it is only some foolish admirer of your beauty. He wants to know your habits, in hopes of falling in with you. You had better let me go out with you for the next month or so. That sort of thing will soon die away." As a necessary consequence of this injudicious revelation, Helen was watched with greater skill and subtlety, and upon a plan well calculated to disarm suspicion. A spy watched the door, and by a signal unintelligible to any but his confederate, whom Helen could not possibly see, set the latter on her track. They kept this game up unobserved for several days, but learned nothing, for Helen was at a standstill. At last they got caught, and by a truly feminine stroke of observation. A showily dressed man peeped into a shop where Helen was buying gloves. With one glance of her woman's eye she recognized a large breastpin in the worst possible taste. Then her eye went up and recognized the features of her seedy follower, though he was now dressed up to the nine. She withdrew her eye directly, completed her purchase, and went home, brooding defence and vengeance. That evening she dined with a lady who had a large acquaintance with lawyers, and it so happened that Mr. Tolmash and Mr. Hennessy were both of the party. Now, when these gentlemen saw Helen in full costume, a queen in form as well as face, coroneted with her island pearls, environed with a halo of romance, and courted by women as well as men, they looked up to her with astonishment, and made up to her in a very different style from that in which they had received her visit. Tolmash she received coldly. He had defended Robert Penfold feebly, and she hated him for it. Hennessy she received graciously, and remembering Robert's precept to be supple as a woman, bewitched him. He was good-natured, able, and vain. By 11 o'clock she had enlisted him in her service. When she had conquered him she said slyly, "But I ought not to speak of these things to you except through a solicitor." "That is the general rule," said the learned counsel. "But in this case no dark body must come between me and the sun." In short, he entered into Penfold's case with such well-feigned warmth, to please the beauteous girl, that at last she took him by the horns and consulted. "I am followed," said she. "I have no doubt you are, and on a large scale. If there is room for another, I should be glad to join the train." "Ha, ha! I'll save you the trouble. I'll meet you half-way. But, to be serious, I am watched, spied, and followed by some enemy to that good friend whose sacred cause we have undertaken. Forgive me for saying we." "I am too proud of the companionship to let you off. We is the word." "Then advise me what to do. I want to retaliate. I want to discover who is watching me, and why. Can you advise me? Will you?" The counsel reflected a moment, and Helen, who watched him, remarked the power that suddenly came into his countenance and brow. "You must watch the spies. I have influence in Scotland Yard, and will get it done for you. If you went there yourself, they would cross-examine you and decline to interfere. I'll go myself for you, and put it in a certain light. An able detective will call on you. Give him 10 guineas, and let him into your views in confidence. Then he will work the public machinery for you." "Oh, Mr. Hennessy, how can I thank you?" "By succeeding. I hate to fail. And now your cause is mine." Next day a man with a hooked nose, a keen black eye, and a solitary foible, mosaic, called on Helen Rolleston, and told her he was to take her instructions. She told him she was watched, and thought it was done to baffle a mission she had undertaken. But having got so far, she blushed and hesitated. "The more you tell me, miss, the more use I can be," said Mr. Burt. Thus encouraged, and also remembering Mr. Hennessy's advice, she gave Mr. Burt, as coldly as she could, an outline of Robert Penfold's case, and of the exertions she had made and the small result. Burt listened keenly and took a note or two, and when she had done he told her something in return. "Miss Rolliston," said he, "I am the officer that arrested Robert Penfold. It cost me a grinder that he knocked out." "Oh, dear!" said Helen. "How unfortunate! Then I fear I cannot reckon on your services." "Why not, miss? What, do you think I hold spite against a poor fellow for defending himself? Besides, Mr. Penfold wrote me a very proper note. Certainly for a parson the gent is a very quick hitter. But he wrote very square, said he hoped I would allow for the surprise and the agitation of an innocent man. Sent me 2 guineas, too, and said he would make it 20, but he was poor as well as unfortunate. That letter has stuck in my gizzard ever since. Can't see the color of felony in it. Your felon is never in a fault. And if he wears a good coat he isn't given to show fight." "It was very improper of him to strike you," said Helen, "and very noble of you to forgive it. Make him still more ashamed of it. Lay him under a deep obligation." "If he is innocent I'll try and prove it," said the detective. He then asked her if she had taken notes. She said she had a diary. He begged to see it. She felt inclined to withhold it because of the comments; but remembering that this was womanish, and that Robert's orders to her were to be manly on such occasions, she produced her diary. Mr. Burt read it very carefully, and told her it was a very promising case. "You have done a great deal more than you thought," he said. "You have netted the fish." 68. "I netted the fish? What fish?" "The man who forged the promissory note." "Oh, Mr. Burt!" "The same man that forged the newspaper extracts to deceive you forged the promissory note years ago, and the man who is setting spies on you is the man who forged those extracts. So we are sure to nail him. He is in the net, and very much to your credit. Leave the rest to me. I'll tell you more about it to morrow. You must order your carriage at 1 o'clock to morrow and drive down to Scotland Yard. Go into the yard, and you will see me. Follow me without a word. When you go back, the other spies will be so frightened they will go off to their employer, and so we shall nail him." Helen complied with these instructions strictly, and then returned home, leaving Mr. Burt to work. She had been home about half an hour when the servant brought her a message saying that a man wanted to speak to her. "Admit him," said Helen. "He is dressed very poor, miss." "Never mind. Send him to me." She was afraid to reject anybody now, lest she might turn her back on information. A man presented himself in well-worn clothes, with a wash-leather face and close-shaven chin. A little of his forehead was also shaven. "Madam, my name is Hand." Helen started. "I have already had the honor of writing to you." "Yes, sir," said Helen, eyeing him with fear and aversion. "Madam, I am come—" He hesitated. "I am an unfortunate man, weighed down by remorse for a thoughtless act that has ruined an innocent man, and nearly cost my worthy employer his life. I come to expiate as far as in me lies. But let me be brief and hurry over the tale of shame. I was a clerk at Wardlaw's office. A bill broker called Adams was talking to me and my fellow clerks, and boasting that nobody could take him in with a feigned signature. Bets were laid. Our vanity was irritated by his pretension. It was my fortune to overhear my young master and his friend Robert Penfold speak about a loan of £2,000. In an evil hour I listened to the tempter, and wrote a forged note for that amount. I took it to Mr. Penfold. He presented it to Adams, and it was cashed. I intended, of course, to call next day and tell Mr. Penfold, and take him to Adams, and restore the money and get back the note. It was not due for 3 months. Alas! That very day it fell under suspicion. Mr. Penfold was arrested. My young master was struck down with illness at his friend's guilt, though he never could quite be got to believe it. And I, miserable coward, dared not tell the truth. Ever since that day I have been a miserable man. The other day I came into money, and left Wardlaw's service. But I carry my remorse with me. Madam, I am come to tell the truth. I dare not tell it to Mr. Wardlaw. I think he would kill me. But I will tell it to you, and you can tell it to him. Ay, tell it to all the world. Let my shame be as public as his whom I have injured so deeply, but heaven knows unintentionally. I Mr. Hand sank all in a heap where he sat, and could say no more. Helen's flesh crawled at this confession, and at the sight of this reptile who owned that he had destroyed Robert Penfold in fear and cowardice. For a long time her wrath so overpowered all sense of pity that she sat trembling, and if eyes could kill, Mr. Hand would not have outlived his confession. At last she contrived to speak. She turned her head away not to see the wretch, and said sternly, "Are you prepared to make this statement on paper if called on?" Mr. Hand hesitated, but said, "Yes." "Then write down that Robert Penfold was innocent, and you are ready to prove it whenever you may be called upon." "Write that down?" said Hand. "Unless your penitence is feigned, you will." "Sooner than that should be added to my crime I will avow all." He wrote the few lines she required. "Now your address, that I may know where to find you at a moment's notice." He wrote, "J. Hand, 11 Warwick Street, Pimlico." Helen then dismissed him, and wept bitterly. In that condition she was found by Arthur Wardlaw, who comforted her, and on hearing her report of Hand's confession, burst out into triumph, and reminded her he had always said Robert Penfold was innocent. "My father," said he, "must yield to this evidence, and we will lay it before the Secretary of State and get his pardon." "His pardon, when he is innocent?" "Oh, that is the form, the only form. The rest must be done by the warm reception of his friends. I, for one, who all these years have maintained his innocence, will be the first to welcome him to my house an honored guest. What am I saying? Can I? Dare I? Ought I? When my wife— Ah, I am more to be pitied than my poor friend is, my friend, my rival. Well, I leave it to you whether he can come into your husband's house." "Never." "But at least I can send the Springbok out and bring him home. And that I will do without one day's delay." "Oh, Arthur," cried Helen, "you set me an example of unselfishness." "I do what I can," said Arthur. "I am no saint. I hope for a reward." Helen sighed. "What shall I do?" "Have pity on me, your faithful lover, and to whom your faith was plighted before ever you saw or knew my unhappy friend. What can I do or suffer more than I have done and suffered for you? My sweet Helen, have pity on me, and be my wife." "I will, some day." "Bless you, bless you. One effort more. What day?" "I can't. I can't. My heart is dead." "This day fortnight. Let me speak to your father. Let him name the day." As she made no reply he kissed her hand devotedly, and did speak to her father. Sir Edward, meaning all for the best, said, "This day fortnight." Chapter 66 through 68